Hello and welcome to News by Standards. Russian President Vladimir Putin would not have invaded Ukraine if he were a woman, according to Boris Johnson. The UK Prime Minister said the crazy macho invasion was a perfect example of toxic masculinity, and he called for more women in positions of power. But Downing Street said there was not a deliberate policy to publicly belittle Mr. Putin. Mr. Johnson's comments come ahead of a NATO meeting where allies will discuss how to respond to future threats. At the summit in Madrid, he is set to call on fellow members of the defensive alliance to ramp up defence spending. The UK's defence spending is projected to reach 2.3% of GDP, a key measure of the annual income of a country, this year as a result of defence industry investment and 1.3 billion in military support for Ukraine, the government said. All NATO members have committed to spend 2% of their GDP on defence, but in 2021 the target had only been reached or exceeded by 8 countries, including the US. The spending target has been a source of tension within NATO in the past, with members pledging to work towards the 2% mark by 2024. At Wednesday's NATO summit, Mr. Johnson will say that over the next 10 years, the threats around us are only going to grow. The 2% was always meant to be a floor, not a ceiling, and allies must continue to step up in this time of crisis, he will add. On Tuesday, UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace urged Mr. Johnson to increase spending on the UK's armed forces even further, in the light of the threat posed by Russia. Mr. Wallace told the BBC he was keen to have a grown-up discussion about how much the UK spends on defence, and warned that the country could no longer bank on a peace dividend. He said this level of spending was justified given the threat posed by Russia, which has demonstrated it will take action against anyone or anybody. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said the government had been cutting defence for 10 years and that the armed forces needed a reboot in light of what's happening in Ukraine. Speaking after the G7 summit of wealthy nations in Bavaria, Mr. Johnson gave an interview to German broadcaster ZDF. On gender equality and the importance of education, he said, "You need more women in positions of power. If Putin was a woman, which he obviously isn't, but if he were, I really don't think he would have embarked on a crazy macho war of invasion and violence in the way that he was," Mr. Johnson said. "If you want a perfect example of toxic masculinity, it's what he's doing in Ukraine." Asked about the remarks, the Prime Minister's official spokesman said there is not a deliberate policy, adding the British public would expect leaders to be robust, with someone calling the innocent killing of civilians on a daily basis. Mr. Johnson's comments about Russia's president echo those he made during a discussion with G7 leaders at a meeting in Germany earlier this week. The leaders mocked the macho portrayal of Mr. Putin, with Mr. Johnson jokingly suggesting they show them our pecs to prove we're tougher than Putin. In his interview with ZDF, Mr. Johnson also said that while G7 leaders desperately wanted an end to the war in Ukraine, there was no deal available currently. But he also described the summit as incredible as leaders got closer and closer to an agreement. Mr. Johnson said the West must support Ukraine's military strategy in order to get President Volodymyr Zelensky in the best possible position in negotiations with Russia when talks eventually come. The NATO meeting comes after weeks that Turkey has reached a deal with prospective members Finland and Sweden, removing a final barrier to their joining. Mr. Johnson said Mr. Putin had been proved completely wrong in his hopes to reduce NATO dominance as the two countries move closer to joining the defence alliance. Arriving at the summit, the PM said the first lesson is that if Vladimir Putin was hoping he would be getting less NATO on his western front as a result of his unprovoked illegal invasion of Ukraine, he's been proved completely wrong. He's getting more NATO.